saw what the letter Pei represents the mouth, and then Ra, and then the Hay on the end of it. Out of the mouth comes evil, blasphemy. Out of the mouth of the evil one, fruits produce. Well, as we began to look at it, we found that there were 7 years of plenty where the opportunity to store up for 7 years of famine was given to everybody. Yes. Go back and look at it. Joseph spread the word and established cities and granaries and gave everybody the opportunity to store up. You know, they depended on the government to take care of them. Oh, I wonder where I've heard of that before. Well, as I looked at that last evening, we were talking about Joseph told Pharaoh, you know, you need to set aside a fifth of the land for yourself. And as we were looking, my brother showed me a map where of all the federal lands, and we hadn't made the connection, of all the federal lands that are currently owned by the government as we speak. And I thought, my goodness, I wonder if the total percentage of federally owned land in this nation would total up to the 5% that Pharaoh has set aside for himself. I believe it does. As we continue to look at this, we find the illustration with the dream that Pharaoh had. He saw 7 cows, fat cows and lean cows, and then he saw 7 fat ears of grain and 7 lean. Let me show you something about these 7 cows. We were talking about it last evening. The 7 years of plenty, the 7 cows represented by that, were always connected to an aleph and tav. How many of you want to survive and have plenty in the midst of famine? Well, there's only one way. You've got to be connected to the direct object, called the aleph and tav, the et. Of course, that represents the Alpha and Omega in the Greek, the Messiah, the first and the last, the everlasting one, the one who was and is to come. Now, in Genesis 41, verse 2, it describes the cows as fat-fleshed. Strong's number 1277, the word is bari. Of course, it means fattened, and it's indicating prosperity by that term fattening. And I'm going to share this with you. That we're talking about a prosperity message that the church has lost the understanding of. Okay? This word bari is from the root of Strong's 1254, bara, which means to create. And only in the Torah is Yahweh the subject of that one verb. Wherever you see the word bara, creating, Yahweh is the only one that was able to do that. Are you hear me? Now, the word bari, 1277, is closely related to 1285, barit. And that word is a noun that means a covenant agreement. Did you notice? There's something about the 7 fat-fleshed cows and covenant cutting that you need to pay attention to. And when I was looking at that word bari, it has a beit resh with a yod on the end of it. Beit resh is also the word for bar, meaning son. And the yod on the end of it, the suffix, means my son. So if I want to enjoy 7 years where we see fat-fleshed cows, hello, I need to be connected in covenant to my son, Yahweh. Isn't that what it said? Well, that's exactly what I believe is happening. Only those who are in covenant agreement with Yahweh will experience prosperity in the midst of the coming famine by storing up Torah against it. The other cows were lean flesh and gaunt. The word for lean flesh there, Strong's number 1851, dach, which means to be beaten or pulverized into small bits. When Yahweh smokes you, there ain't much left. The word bari, as I said, could mean my son. And you know, as I was looking at it, both types, now pay attention here, notice this. Both types of cattle have their flesh described. Either they're fat or lean. The word for flesh, Strong's number 1320, is the word basar. Of course, it means flesh, but it also is a word in Hebrew for gospel or good news. Thus, the gospel of my son will prosper you or pulverize you depending on your covenant relationship. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, don't get pulverized. You understand what I just said? It is the gospel, the message of Yeshua, salvation, that will either prosper you or pulverize you. It's either a promised word or a destroying word. It's a sharp two-edged sword. Now, what seems to be happening as we begin to look at these two houses, the great house of Pharaoh and, of course, the house of Yahweh, demonstrated by Joseph, is that the house of Pharaoh is occupied by the great adulteress. The house of Yahweh is occupied by Joseph. The house of Pharaoh is occupied by a counterfeit. Are you hearing me? Now pay attention, because this is a shadow picture of what's happening in the days ahead. Pharaoh is going to have a counterfeit occupy his house. And Pharaoh's house and its occupants are going to do everything they can to mix and mingle themselves with the house of Yahweh in the last days. Are y'all hearing me? Both houses became equally fruitful and flourished, and both houses will stand at Miketz, the end. There's another paradox here. There's a contradiction between the role of Pharaoh versus the role of Joseph, and Joseph is a shadow picture, if you will, of Messiah ben Yosef, Messiah the suffering servant. Remember the word parah, the word for bull, which represents one set aside for sacrifice? Well, that's exactly what Joseph represents, the Messiah who became the sacrificed bull. The ironic thing about it is that the emblem representing the house of Joseph is just that, a bull. But did you know that there's an emblem that also represents the house of Pharaoh? It was also a bull, Apis and Hathor. And we see that in this nation today. One of the primary things that drives this nation is whether or not the bull flourishes. Don't say I'm full of bull. Talk about the bull market, the stock market. It's the God that drives this nation. Now, we say we'd never make the same mistakes that Israel did. We're smarter and wiser, further along, more civilized. Israel prostrated themselves to a golden calf. You and I have got a full-grown bull. Say it ain't so. One bull serves the people and dies for them. The other bull compels the people to serve him and die. Did you hear me? One becomes a house of liberty and fruitfulness. The other becomes a house of bondage and famine. We've just looked at Pharaoh. We've looked at Yosef. I want to look at the other prominent name, the place called Egypt. We began to examine it last night. Strong's number 4714, Mitzrayim. It means, or it can mean, double straits. I shared last night it means you're betwixt a rock and a hard place. Some of y'all are familiar with that. You've been chafed on both sides. Hello? Seems like you thought you were an immovable object and you hit an unstoppable force. Now there's a great controversy ensuing and you're betwixt and between. Well, that word Mitzrayim means a constricted place, a place that will draw you into bondage. And if you go back and look at Abiram Publications, Biblical Name Vault, they give a definition for that word Egypt. And it is translated or defined as the temple of Ptah. And the word Ptah is really the end of Egypt. Say that again. Excuse me. Ptah, Egypt. Are you hearing me? Well, this pagan deity, who, by the way, you may understand he's kind of relatively unknown, but did you know there's a temple to this god in Memphis, Tennessee? Yes. The temple of Ptah. And there was a Memphis, Egypt, where this god was worshipped. And the ironic thing about him is that he was known as the creator god, hear me now, who brought all things into being by thinking them and then saying their names with his tongue. Isn't that just like a counterfeit? Hello. And we sit and listen to him. And he speaks all of these things into our minds. And he says them with his tongue. And do you realize we need to be careful with these gates? Because whatever comes in these gates You can't blame the devil for getting in. He cannot get in. Yahweh himself cannot go beyond the entrance to this gate unless I open it. Yeshua said, I stand at the door and knock. If any man will open the door, well, Hasatan's the same way. He can't force the door open. If we open him, then the blame shifts from him to me. And if I open the door to the one who brought things into being, I'm talking about blasphemous perah, blasphemous evil things by thinking them and saying them with his tongue, then you and I are in deep trouble. Amen. That's why Mark 4:24 says, take heed to what you hear. Did you know everything in the kingdom is based on one principle? It's a spiritual principle. You can talk about faith. You can talk about healing. You can talk about the fruit of the Spirit, the gifts of the Spirit. You can talk about the Word. Everything in the kingdom is based on the principle called the law of sowing and reaping. Everything. Sowing. That's why you have to be careful what you hear, because when you hear it, guess what? You will reap according to your hearing. For with the measure you measure it with. Are you hearing me? The root of the word Mitzrayim comes from Strong's number 2526. You're familiar with this. This is the name of one of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham. His name means hot, but it also means to be inflamed. Inflamed with what? Inflamed as in one who is given to carnal sexual perversions. And if you go back and research it, we don't have the time tonight, but in Genesis you'll find that Ham was the one that found his father in a drunken stupor and came in and uncovered his father's nakedness. Now that is a euphemistic term that's seen throughout Torah to infer that he's uncovered his father's bed. In other words, what happens while his father's in a compromised state, Ham comes in and has an incestual relationship with his own mother and produces a son called Canaan. That's why Yahweh had Noah to curse the result of that incestuous relationship rather than Ham. Well, the nature of Ham is the one who is given to, he has a proclivity towards sexual perversions, and so he becomes Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, the mem prefix, means that's the origin of that perversion. And so the land of Mitzrayim, or Egypt, is named after this individual. So Mitzrayim becomes known as the stronghold of bondage, and in particular sexual perversion. And historically, if you go back and look at it, Egypt was the house that tried to do everything they could to uncover the nakedness of the house of Israel. To do exactly the same thing that Ham had did to his father Noah. And there's some illustrations you can go back and see. You remember when Pharaoh took Sarah, Abraham's wife, and the excuse for that was, well, she's my sister. I don't want to be injured. If someone says something to you, Sarah, you tell her you're also my sister. Well, what happens here is that Pharaoh desires her and takes her into the house. It was not just because she was beautiful, even though she was. She was desirable, but Pharaoh was an instrument of the enemy that was about to be used to compromise the lineage of Abraham. Galatians chapter 3 talks about the seed of Abraham, and seed being singular, not plural, and that's talking about Messiah. And if he could have had his way with Sarah, Messiah would not have come. That's why Pharaoh took Sarah into his house. But guess what? Yahweh plagued him. I got news for you. The plagues that Pharaoh saw and the Pharaoh that knew Moses will be nothing compared to the plagues that this latter-day Pharaoh, also known as Antichrist, the son of perdition, the wicked one, the lawless one, is going to see. But the thing that should be a constraining force to us is the fact that the plagues fell on Goshen and Egypt at the same time. And so if you go back and read Revelation, you'll see that you and I are going to have to endure some plaguing. Why? Well, simply because of complacency and lethargy and the fact that we're like Samson asleep in the lap of Delilah. It wasn't until Samson had his eyes put out. Why put out his eyes? Well, it was the eyes of Samson that became the gateway for all the lusts and perversions, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh. When he had his eyes put out, he became